Hey guys, tonight we venture into a world wrapped in ice and legend, where the nights stretch long, the winds slice like blades, and survival depends on more than brute strength. You're standing on a snow-covered hilltop, the fjords below choked with ice and mist curling from your lips with every breath. The sky is dark, not from the time of night, but because the sun barely bothers to show up these days. You blink, snowflakes catching in your lashes. Your boots crunch through deep drifts as you trudge toward the only beacon in this frozen silence. A longhouse, its roof heavy with snow, its thick wooden doors glowing orange from the firelight within. It's the Viking Age, and this is winter. The kind of cold that doesn't just bite, it chews. Honestly, you probably wouldn't survive this. Like, if you're out here in modern sneakers and thermal gear from your local mall. Nope. You're an ice sculpture by breakfast. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments, where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The door creaks open and you step into the longhouse. Blinking through the smoky air, it's warm. Almost too warm. The kind of stuffy heat that clings to your clothes and makes your cheeks flush. There's a central hearth blazing with flames, the crackle of logs swallowed by the steady hum of conversation, and the occasional grunt of someone repositioning on a bench. This is where it all happens in winter. Cooking, crafting, sleeping, snoring, gossiping, chanting, and sometimes even sword polishing. And no, that's not a euphemism. Longhouses were the architectural lifeblood of Viking communities. Built low and wide like a wooden loaf of bread, they were designed for durability against fierce winds and heavy snow. The walls were often made of timber or turf layered over wattle and daub, basically woven branches smeared with a paste of mud, straw, and weirdly, cow dung. Yep, cozy and cow approved. The roof was steeply pitched to shrug off snow, and often thatched with layers of straw or turf. Sometimes entire families, up to 30 people or more, shared one longhouse. Add in servants, a few livestock, and a couple of very judgmental cats, and you've got a chaotic winter cocktail. You shuffle past a group of children playing with carved wooden toys on the floor, woolen mittens dangling from their sleeves like sleepy noodles. A woman spins yarn by the fire, her foot tapping in rhythm as she works the spindle. Beside her, an old man sharpens a knife, the stone scraping in soft, hypnotic strokes. This is Viking winter survival. Not solo, not silent, but social. Heat wasn't just about fire, it was about people. Body heat mattered, and the more people packed together, the warmer it stayed. Historians still argue whether the hearths were kept burning all night or allowed to dim. Some believe fires were carefully tended through the darkness, with shifts to keep embers glowing. Others think the fire might have died out by morning, especially if wood was scarce. Either way, if you were cold in a Viking longhouse, it wasn't for lack of effort. Quirky fact time? Alright, some longhouses had smoke holes in the roof to vent the fire's fumes, but others didn't bother. Why? Because the smoke helped insulate the ceiling. That's right, inhale the cozy toxicity. You might be warm, but your lungs are seasoning themselves like cured fish. As you settle onto a fur-draped bench, you notice the rhythm of the room. Meals are simple but satisfying. Gruel, dried meat, maybe a turnip stew if you're lucky. A pot hangs over the fire, bubbling lazily. Someone adds a pinch of salt and what might be a dried mushroom. Let's pretend it's the edible kind. A shaggy dog pads over and flops at your feet, steaming slightly from the snow still clinging to its fur. You scratch behind its ears and it thumps its tail thwack 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 against the dirt floor. Outside, the wind howls like a chorus of banshees, slamming against the thick door. But in here, you're wrapped in warmth, smells, and stories. And the occasional fart. Seriously, 30 people, one room, no ventilation? It's a scent experience. Despite the conditions, Vikings weren't just hibernating. They stayed busy, making tools, weaving cloth, mending sails. Children learned from their elders, listening to tales of gods and monsters, of distant raids and heroic deaths. The days were short, the nights eternal. You slept when you could, ate when food was hot, and tried not to trip over the goats. There's something hypnotic about the rhythm of Viking winter life. The steady hiss of the fire, the murmur of voices, the scratch of carving knives shaping wood into spoons, gods, or game pieces. And in the corner, someone hums a melody that sounds older than the mountains. You lean back against the wall, the fur at your back soft but slightly damp. Someone hands you a wooden cup of something warm and slightly alcoholic. Maybe mead, maybe just warm goat milk with a surprise kick. You sip it slowly, feeling it thaw the icicles clinging to your ribs. You glance around. The fire dances in iron cauldrons. Shadows flicker across the walls. The woman spinning yarn hasn't stopped once, her fingers a blur. The dog beside you snores. This is survival, not just of the body, but of the spirit. You don't battle the winter, you outlast it. You wake with a crick in your neck, a woolen blanket half slid off your shoulder, and the unmistakable sound of someone loudly chewing dried fish too close to your ear. Welcome to the second act of Viking winter life. The fashion show, but make it functional or die. There's no central heating here. The fire helps, sure, but it's not enough to reach every drafty corner of a longhouse. The real barrier between your fragile skin and the cold claws of the Norse winter? Layers? South many. Layers. You stretch and start dressing, piece by piece. First comes the undertunic, woven thick from sheep's wool. It's scratchy, smells faintly of smoke, and is the color of week-old porridge. Perfect. Over that, you pull on a heavier overtunic, maybe dyed with woad for a touch of style, assuming you weren't too poor to afford color. Woad is that blue dye made from plants, in case you were wondering. Yes, the same one warriors smeared on their faces like they were off to headline a Viking Coachella. Next up, trousers. Think thick wool leggings, basically ancient thermal joggers. Tied at the waist with a braided cord. Are they flattering? Not even a little. Are they warm? Absolutely. Vikings didn't dress to slay, they dressed to survive. Then come the leg wraps. Narrow bands of wool spiraled from ankle to knee. They keep the wind from knifing up your legs like a Nordic ghost with an attitude problem. Some historians think they doubled as protection during combat or travel, but mostly they just kept your shins from freezing off mid-snowstorm. Your feet? Wrapped in strips of fur or stuffed into leather shoes with hay for insulation. Vikings didn't have waterproof boots, so many just layered multiple pairs of socks. Yes, even back then they had to deal with wet, cold toes, and the existential misery of stepping in snowmelt. Now the outer layers. Fur-lined cloaks, fastened with brooches, sometimes passed down for generations. Not only did these keep people warm, they also shouted status. A cloak made from reindeer, fox, or even bear fur meant you either had wealth or you were gutsy enough to wrestle a bear, possibly both. And let's not forget the hats. Woolen caps, sometimes with flaps, sometimes conical, all delightfully awkward looking but necessary. You might also wear mittens, likely two-fingered, so you could still hold an axe and wave at your enemies in one elegant motion. Now for the weird part. Some outerwear was made from sealskin. Yup. Waterproof, windproof, and incredibly effective at keeping out sea spray and sleet. But good luck not smelling like low tide. Vikings near coastal regions embraced seal-based fashion not for glamour, but because nothing else kept the chill out quite like it. One saga even mentions a man whose cloak was so thick his enemies couldn't stab through it. Fashion and stab protection. Talk about multitasking. Here's a quirky fringe tidbit for you. Archaeologists in Greenland uncovered Viking burials where the deceased were wrapped in layers of clothing upon layers of clothing. One man had 4 tunics, 2 cloaks, and a wool cap. No shoes, though. Historians still argue whether that was because he died indoors or because someone swiped his boots on the way out. Clothing wasn't just about layering, it was a full-time task. If you weren't shearing sheep, you were carding wool. If you weren't spinning, you were weaving. If you weren't weaving, you were patching holes in the knee of your husband's favorite pants for the 3rd time this week, because someone keeps slipping on frozen goat poop. Everything was handmade. No zippers, no synthetic fleece. Just the grind of looms, the rhythm of needle and thread, and the quiet camaraderie of winter work. And believe it or not, Vikings loved textiles. They weren't just practical, they were art. Complex patterns, intricate dyes, dyed borders with braids or embroidery. Even in the darkest months, they added color where they could. And here's a fun one. Lice were everywhere. Sorry, but yeah, with all that wool and fur in close contact, these little freeloaders had a great time. Viking combs, beautifully carved from bone or antler, are some of the most common artifacts found. They combed often, partly for hygiene and partly because the scratching probably felt amazing when you hadn't showered in a month. In fact, Viking grooming habits are often misunderstood. Despite the layers and the dirt, they cared about their appearance. They bathed weekly, more than most of Europe at the time, and took pride in being well kept. Even their sagas describe heroes who are freshly washed and brushed before battle, like they're prepping for a H&M runway. Helmets and Murder Edition. Outside, the temperatures dropped even further. Ice crystals cling to the eaves like nature's own chandeliers. But you're prepared now, wrapped head to toe in animal skins, wool, and the occasional waft of smoked meat. You step outside, boots crunching into fresh snow. Breath mists from your nose and your fur cloak flaps behind you dramatically like a fantasy movie extra who wandered into the wrong scene. A few villagers are chopping wood near the edge of the longhouse, their axes ringing through the silence. Others are checking that the livestock haven't frozen in their sleep. One woman stands perfectly still, hands tucked inside her sleeves, eyes watching the horizon. You wonder what she sees. Another snowstorm coming? Wolves in the distance? Or maybe she's just spacing out because she hasn't had coffee since the 10th century. The wind picks up. It slaps your face with the elegance of a frozen fish. But you're layered. You're bundled. You're a walking, breathing pile of prehistoric knitwear, and honestly, you feel kind of unstoppable. You glance down at your fur-lined mittens, then up at the smoke curling from the longhouse chimney. And for a brief moment, you get it. You get why the Vikings could live like this, thrive like this. They didn't beat winter with brute force. They smothered it in sheep's wool, sealed it out with stitched leather, and laughed about it over shared bowls of stew. And now that you're warm, it's time to see where you'll sleep. The fire crackles behind you as you step back inside, your outer cloak dusted with snow and a smear of soot streaking one mitten. Welcome to the true heart of Viking survival, the longhouse. Not just a home, but a womb of wood and warmth, where dozens lived, breathed, snored, and occasionally stepped on each other in the dark. It smells like smoke, wet wool, and stew. A little musky, a little spicy. A lot like 20 humans have been, breathing in the same enclosed space since the last solstice. You step carefully around the central hearth, its flames curling gently under a blackened cauldron that's been bubbling since sunrise. A mix of meat scraps, root vegetables, and barley. Not exactly Michelin-starred, but after a walk in the snow, divine. This longhouse is about 20 meters long, maybe 5 wide. It's built like a wooden ship flipped upside down, curved beams arching like ribs, fitted together with serious woodworking skills and zero nails. The walls are thick with wattle and daub, or stacked turf if you're up north, where wood's a luxury. You'd think turf would feel drafty, but actually, that stuff insulates like a dream. It's the Viking version of double glazing. There's a raised wooden platform lining both sides of the room. These are your beds, your benches, your dining seats, your storage spaces. Everything, really. You sleep on them, you sit on them, you store extra food, clothing, weapons, and occasionally a chicken or two beneath them. In the dead of winter, these benches are where life happens. Your bed for the night? It's a straw mattress laid directly on the platform, covered in woolen blankets and maybe a fur or two if you're lucky. Or if you were smart enough to make friends with the lady who tans hides. The straw smells earthy, a little sharp. It pokes through the linen sheets, itchy but dry. Better than the ground, which by this point is mostly frozen mud and goat droppings. A few people are already curled up for the night. Most are fully clothed, no one stripping down to undies in this weather. That's a one-way trip to Pneumonia Town. You spot a kid sleeping curled around a small dog, both breathing in sync. Someone else has bundled two toddlers in a shared fur and tucked them under the platform near the hearth for maximum heat. One man lies snoring with his hand still resting on his axe. You suspect it's not entirely for show. Sleep in the Viking Age wasn't about privacy, it was about warmth. The more people packed together, the less heat escaped. It's not uncommon for families to sleep shoulder to shoulder, layered under shared blankets, occasionally interrupted by snores, coughs, or someone accidentally kicking your shin in their sleep. Oh, and let's not forget the livestock. In many longhouses, animals like goats, sheep, or even a prized cow were brought inside during the worst of winter. Not only for protection from wolves or frostbite, but because those big, warm, farting bodies radiated heat. Historians still argue whether animals were penned at one end of the longhouse or roamed more freely among their human companions. Personally, given the smell, you'd hope there was at least some form of segregation. Quirky fact incoming. Some archaeologists believe longhouses were designed with double-door entrances, not for dramatic effect, but to prevent icy blast from sweeping through the living area every time someone popped out to, say, go pee or check if the snow had eaten the chickens. Think of it as a Viking-era mudroom/wind buffer. Now, speaking of nighttime needs, there were no toilets inside. If you had to go, you braved the cold. You'd grab your boots, your cloak, and scurry out to the midden. Basically, the garbage heap/toilet pit at the edge of the homestead. Some households had designated chamber pots, but let's be honest, if it was minus 30 degrees Celsius outside, that chamber pot was getting a lot of use. Just maybe don't sit near it. Back inside, light flickers from oil lamps carved out of soapstone, fueled with animal fat. The glow is dim but warm, casting long shadows along the smoky ceiling. You can barely make out the soot-stained beams overhead. From one of them dangles a rack of drying herbs. Thyme, maybe some juniper. A little something to keep the room from smelling entirely like socks and seal blubber. People are beginning to settle in. A woman wraps a toddler in a thick shawl and hums something soft and circular. A lullaby with no beginning or end. The fire dies down. The room falls into hush. There's a moment of stillness broken only by the faint sound of a man somewhere in the back, adjusting his position with the subtle grace of a walrus. Then quiet again. And this? This is what home looked like. Not tidy, not clean in the modern sense, but safe, functional, alive. Your spot on the bench feels surprisingly warm, having absorbed heat from the fire and the bustling bodies earlier. You lie back, pull a fur up to your chin, and feel the gentle press of straw beneath you. Outside, the wind still howls like a beast in heat. The walls creak, but you're inside. You're wrapped in wool, your belly's full of stew. You're listening to the steady breathing of people who've survived dozens of winters like this. It's not glamorous, it's not Instagrammable, but it's enough you close your eyes. And in that moment, you could almost forget that outside, the cold waits with teeth bared and snowdrifts high, enough to bury a cart. Almost. Your eyes flicker open in the dim orange haze of early morning, or what passes for morning this far north in the dead of winter. Technically, the sun's up, but it's more of a suggestion than a commitment. A grayish glow peeks through the thatched gaps in the longhouse roof. diffused and tired looking, like even the daylight couldn't be bothered today. You stretch, but not too far. The low-hanging smoke layer still floats near the ceiling, and unless you enjoy an accidental cough fit before breakfast, you keep your face close to the mattress of straw and wool. Around you, the room stirs. A few people are already up, shuffling around, stoking the fire, tossing in logs. Someone coughs, someone sneezes, someone trips over a chicken. The familiar Viking soundtrack. But let's rewind for a moment, because while the longhouse was key to staying warm during the waking hours, sleeping through the frigid night, that was a survival game all its own. Viking beds weren't what you might hope for. No plush mattresses or personal duvets. What you got was a bench, or for the well-off, a curtained box bed on a raised platform, stuffed with straw or hay and layered with woolen blankets. If you were poor, well, it was likely just a pile of furs on the dirt floor near the fire. Either way, the mattress was homemade, the bed frame creaky, and the room full of sounds and smells that would make your modern Airbnb host cry. People slept in groups. Family members, friends, even servants. It wasn't about comfort. It was about not freezing your eyelids shut. Think of it as Viking cuddle piles. No shame. You're not being cozy. You're being practical. Children slept sandwiched between parents. Elders slept closest to the fire. The sick were tended in bed with warm broths, herbal remedies, and prayers to Thor or Freya, depending on which deity you thought answered midnight calls faster. And if you were alone, there was always the sheep. Seriously. Small livestock were often brought into the longhouse at night, not just for protection, but because they radiated body heat like portable heaters in fleece pajamas. You shift under your fur. It's heavy. Almost too heavy. Viking furs weren't dainty throws, they were entire pelts. Bear, wolf, boar, fox, seal. Imagine sleeping under something that used to be the alpha predator. Comforting? Yes. A little creepy? Also yes. Your tunic's still on, of course. No one in their right mind stripped before sleep. In fact, you probably added layers. Another shirt. An extra pair of socks. Maybe even a hat. Vikings were not here for bedtime fashion. They were here to not become people sickles. There's a soft groan from the other side of the bench. An older woman is waking up, adjusting her shawl, her long silver braid poking out from beneath a woolen cap. She gives you a look that says, "I've seen 30 winters and I'm still cold," before tossing more fur over her legs. Quirky fact? In Iceland, some Vikings slept standing up. Not the entire night, mind you, but in shifts during outdoor travel. They'd lean against horses, wrapped in cloaks, catching cat naps while snow howled around them. Historians still argue whether this was a regular survival method or just poetic saga exaggeration, but either way, it paints a heck of a picture. You, eyes half-lidded, leaning against a shivering horse in 3 a.m. darkness, mumbling something about mead and better life choices. And speaking of night, here's something strange. Vikings likely had segmented sleep. It wasn't just go to bed, wake up at sunrise. Many cultures in the Middle Ages, including Norse societies, slept in 2 chunks. First sleep, then a waking period, an hour or 2 to pray, eat, talk, or yes, snuggle, followed by a second sleep. Sounds weird? Maybe. But try it next time your insomnia kicks in. It might just be your inner Viking clock saying hi. Back in the longhouse, the fire is roaring again. Someone's stirring up the ashes from last night, reviving embers buried in charcoal and blowing gently through a bone pipe to coax the flames. Sparks dance. The smell of smoke thickens. The day is beginning. Breakfast is already cooking. Flatbread, maybe a bit of dried fish, and hot broth. You drag yourself from the bench, boots thudding onto the packed dirt floor, and shuffle toward the hearth like a half-frozen zombie with bed hair that could house birds. And then you hear it. Laughter. Loud, cheerful, belly-deep laughter from a boy being tickled by what looks like a very determined grandmother. He's squealing, rolling in furs, wriggling like a beached seal. And suddenly the cold feels manageable. Because here's the heart of it all. Warmth didn't come from just fire or furs. It came from each other. From shared bodies, shared stories, shared lives. In the darkest months, you didn't survive by retreating into solitude. You survived by leaning into the closeness. You take your place near the fire, wrapped in last night's fur, steaming bowl in your hands. A woman passes you a chunk of coarse bread and sits beside you without saying a word, her warmth pressing against your shoulder. No boundaries, no awkwardness, just two people soaking up heat like seals on a sun rock. And outside, the wind howls again, relentless. But inside, you're wrapped in the quiet hum of Viking life, and slowly it begins to feel like home. The day wears on, or at least you assume it does. Hard to tell, really, when the sky outside stays that eternal blue-gray soup of cloud and snow. Time feels stretchy in the Viking winter, like it's been kneaded too many times and left to rise by the hearth. You're not doing much. Nobody is. Not in the modern sense. There are no productivity apps, no notifications buzzing, no meetings scheduled except the unspoken agreement that everyone will somehow not freeze to death today. And that, in itself, is work. Which brings us to the next major question of Viking winter survival. What's for dinner? Spoiler alert, it's probably fish. You glance toward the cauldron swinging gently over the hearth. The smell wafting up is complicated. A little smoky, a little sour, a little mysterious. Is it turnip stew? Dried cod and onion soup? Boiled seal meat with seaweed? Honestly, it could be all of the above. The Viking pantry in winter was a tightrope walk between ingenuity and desperation. When fresh food vanished with the summer sun, preservation took center stage. Smoking, drying, fermenting, salting. If it could be kept in a barrel or hung in the rafters, it was fair game. The family you're staying with pulls out a few delicacies. First, dried fish. Probably cod or haddock. It's stiff as a board, flaking like ancient paper. You're instructed to soak it in water, then boil it until it stops tasting like driftwood. This takes several hours in a small prayer. And then there's the fermented shark. Yes, this is real. Yes, it smells like someone tried to pickle a corpse in ammonia. And yes, they eat it. Hakarl, as it's called in Iceland, is made by burying a Greenland shark in sand for several months, then hanging it up to dry. Vikings didn't invent this method, but they absolutely would have respected it. Because that, my friend, is commitment to the bit. Now let's sprinkle in some dairy. In summer, cows and goats provide milk, but by winter, the milk's been churned into butter and stored in barrels. You scoop out a lump of sour, golden fat and smear it on flatbread like it's Viking Nutella. It's sharp, greasy, and leaves your lips shining like oiled parchment. Strangely satisfying. Root vegetables, turnips, carrots, onions were buried in cellars to survive the frost. Barley and oats, stored in sacks, used for gruel thick enough to build a house with. Meat? Cured, salted, or smoked. If you were lucky, you'd get lamb. If not, maybe dried horse jerky. Or rat, or nothing. Winter scarcity was real. And then there's blood pudding. Yes, it's exactly what it sounds like. Pig's blood, oats, maybe some chopped fat, stuffed into a sheep's stomach and boiled. It's warm, iron-rich, and surprisingly good when you forget what it is. Quirky detail time. Vikings believed certain foods had magical properties. Garlic and onion were used in folk remedies for frostbite and infection. Fish heads? Boiled for broth and brain jelly, believed to strengthen the mind. Historians still argue whether some of these were based in real medicine, or just very desperate kitchen experiments gone mythic. You sip from a horn cup filled with something hot and murky. It's broth made from boiling bones with a handful of herbs tossed in for luck. Not fancy, but nourishing. And that's the point. In the coldest months, food was fuel. Flavor was a bonus. Still, that didn't stop them from getting creative. You catch a glimpse of a woman grinding dried berries with honey and animal fat, forming little balls to store for later. Sort of a Viking energy bar. There's even a sweet soup made from birch sap and dried apple slices. A dessert, if you squint hard enough. And here's a fringe theory for your sleepy brain. Some archaeologists think the Vikings may have used seaweed not just as filler but for its nutrients, like iodine, which helps with thyroid function. There's no concrete proof they understood the science, but hey, munching on kelp strips might have been the ancient Scandinavian multivitamin. As the day settles into late afternoon, or maybe early evening, who knows, you help with the food prep. You're handed a knife and a turnip. It's misshapen, stubborn, and refuses to be diced without a struggle. By the time you've got it into manageable chunks, you're sweating under your layers. You toss the pieces into the pot, stir slowly, and catch your reflection in the oily surface of the stew. Wind-chapped cheeks, soot-smudged forehead, eyes a little bleary, a little wide. You don't look like a modern tourist anymore. You look like someone who lives here. And just as you're settling into the rhythm, someone walks in with a bundle wrapped in fur. They unroll it by the fire. It's a fish. An entire dried fish, braided into a twist and tied with twine. It looks like it was dehydrated in the mouth of a volcano. They call it stockfish. It's rock hard, smells like ocean and salt, and must be hammered with a mallet before cooking. Vikings used to rehydrate it slowly, then boil it into oblivion with onions and herbs. You help break it apart, each crack echoing like a tiny war drum. And yes, you try some later. It's chewy, it's salty, it tastes like the sea remembered your sins. But it's not bad, because when food is scarce, you learn to appreciate the weird. You lean into it, you chew through it, and if it keeps you alive another night, it becomes your favorite meal. You sit by the fire as bowls are passed around. Everyone eats slowly, silently, steam rising from wooden spoons. A lull settles across the longhouse. For the first time, your stomach is truly full. Not just with food, but with understanding. That in the world of snow and shadows, survival isn't just about resisting the cold. It's about warming yourself from within. One bite of blood pudding at a time. You sit cross-legged by the hearth, your wooden bowl empty, your belly warm. You're finally full, and honestly, a little impressed you survived fermented fish without losing consciousness. But now, it's time to talk about what the Vikings really relied on to get through winter. Booze, broth, and belly warmers. Or, in other words, hot drinks, old tricks, and a lot of mead. Someone hands you a clay cup filled with a steaming liquid. You take a sip. It's sharp, sweet, earthy, and hits your throat with a heat that surprises you. Mead. Fermented honey wine. The Viking elixir of choice. It's not just a party drink, it's practical. When it's below freezing and your bones feel like icicles, even a few sips of something warm and alcoholic can light a fire in your ribcage. Now, Vikings didn't just drink to get drunk. Okay, yes, they absolutely did during feasts, but they also drank for warmth, ceremony, and even medical reasons. Hot mead with herbs? That's basically Viking NyQuil. And it wasn't just honey-based drinks either. They brewed ales, mulled wine with herbs, and even warm milk mixed with spices if they were low on grain. Vikings were equal parts warriors and resourceful mixologists. And here's a fun one. Some households made a kind of proto-glug, a spiced drink with cloves, cardamom, and wild berries, simmered gently and ladled into shared cups. It smelled like warmth, like the forest in summer pretending it still mattered. If you were lucky, someone added dried apple slices or a few preserved cherries. Of course, if you were really down bad, you could also warm your guts with bone broth. Simmered for hours, sometimes days, Viking broth was rich with marrow, herbs, and fat. Basically liquid survival. Toss in some barley and dried onion? Congratulations, you've got stew. Don't have vegetables? No problem. Just ladle out the hot fat and drink it like a Viking keto latte. Quirky fact alert. Some sagas mention warriors drinking broth or ale mixed with ashes. No, not by accident. This was believed to harden the soul. Maybe spiritual, maybe symbolic. Or maybe it was just what happened when you ran out of herbs and had a lot of leftover firewood. And it wasn't just what they drank, it was how. Picture this. Everyone clustered around the fire, passing the same horn or wooden cup from person to person. No solo sipping. This was a community activity, a shared ritual, like passing a secret handshake around the circle. And yes, if you were sick or coughing, too bad. Vikings didn't believe in germ theory, but they did believe in manners. You drink, you pass. You don't waste mead. You glance around the longhouse. A group is crowded together near the hearth, sharing a thick, bubbling broth with wild herbs. Someone's added dried mushrooms, maybe for taste, maybe for other reasons. You take another sip of mead and feel your chest warm, your limbs soften. The chill in your bones is finally melting. Historians still argue whether mead was drunk daily or reserved for feasts, but most agree that even in the lean months, Vikings found a way to keep the mugs filled, especially when spirits needed lifting. Winter could be long, dark, and full of hopeless silence. A little buzz helped cut the edge. But alcohol wasn't the only belly warmer. There was also movement. Small rituals. You watch as a woman stands and begins stretching her arms and legs. Not a workout, just slow, deliberate movements to keep the blood moving. Inactivity meant cold. Cold meant sickness. So even on the laziest days, Vikings stayed just active enough to avoid freezing in their own blankets. They'd take short walks outside, chop wood when possible, mend clothes, braid rope, or play games. It wasn't about burning calories, it was about generating heat. Want another trick? Vikings used heated stones wrapped in cloth and tucked them under their furs like primitive hot water bottles. You reach toward the edge of the hearth, and sure enough, a smooth stone rests there, glowing faintly with heat. Someone grabs it with tongs, wraps it in hide, and drops it next to a toddler snoring near the fire. Smart, silent, effective. You sip again. The mead hits different now. Calmer, like honey laced with embers. Then there's ritual. Belief. The idea that warmth didn't just come from fire, but from connection. Before bed, someone whispers an old charm into the flames. Something about protection from frost spirits and nighttime wanderers. You don't quite understand the words, but the feeling? Yeah, you get it. And here's a fringe theory that might blow your fur-lined socks off. Some scholars believe Viking children were taught to breathe warm. That is, to control their breath in cold air. Slow, deep inhales through the nose to warm the air before it hit the lungs. It sounds small, but in sub-zero temperatures, it might have been the difference between coughing all night and sleeping like a log. A survival hack passed down quietly from mother to child, with no name, just instinct. The longhouse grows dimmer. The fire crackles lower. Someone stirs the pot one last time. And you? You lean back, full of broth and buzz, wrapped in a fur, hands warmed on your cup, and suddenly aware that for the first time in hours, you're not cold. Not even a little. You're warm. Inside and out. From the mead. From the fire. From the fact that everyone in this longhouse, every tired, coughing, snoring, storytelling soul, is keeping the cold at bay together. Not by conquering it, but by enduring it, one sip at a time. You wake with a jolt. Not because anything's wrong, but because a man just poured a bucket of icy water over his own head. Indoors, at sunrise. While humming, cheerfully. Welcome to Viking hygiene. Yeah, we're going there. Let's bust a myth right now. Vikings were not dirty, stinky, matted-haired brutes as Hollywood likes to paint them. In fact, they were often considered suspiciously clean by their European neighbors. A Saxon chronicler once grumbled that Viking men were so well-groomed they kept stealing our women. Harsh and hilarious. In winter, though, hygiene was less about smelling like flowers and more about not dying of grime-related infections. And the Vikings had a surprising number of tricks up their fur-lined sleeves. Like this man, now standing half naked near the hearth, steam rising off his freshly rinsed body. He grabs a birch branch and starts whipping his own back. Not in a weird way. This is part of the sauna ritual. Yes, saunas were a thing, especially in Sweden and Finland, but also in Norse regions. Tiny huts were heated with rocks until blazing hot. Then water was poured on the stones to create steam. People sat in there sweating like roast pigs before plunging into snowbanks, rivers, or buckets of cold water. Supposedly for health. Probably for bragging rights. You wonder what kind of person sees a freezing river and says, "Yeah, let's jump in for our skin health." But that's the Viking way. Discipline, resilience, and probably a lot of chest hair. They even made primitive soap. Lye soap, made from wood ash and animal fat. Harsh on the skin for sure, but it got the job done. Used for scrubbing clothes, hands, faces, and occasionally scalps, though given how abrasive it was, you probably didn't shampoo twice. Every Viking carried a small grooming kit. Comb, tweezers, ear spoon, and nail pick, usually carved from bone, antler, or wood. These weren't just vanity items, they were survival tools. Lice were a problem. Filth brought disease. And let's be honest, if you're stuck indoors with 20 other people, the least you can do is not smell like a fermented walrus. Quirky fact? Vikings dyed their hair. Yep. Some bleached their hair with lye to achieve a blonde tone, partly due to cultural beauty standards and partly to kill lice. Multitasking Viking style. And body odor? Surprisingly manageable. Thanks to regular bathing, typically once a week, usually on Lagerdag or washing day, yes, our modern Saturday, and steam baths, they stayed relatively fresh. Compared to some medieval neighbors who considered bathing sinful, the Vikings smelled like spring. Historians still argue whether women participated equally in sauna rituals or maintained more modest practices, but evidence suggests everyone took part in some form of winter washing. You'd rinse, scrub, warm up by the fire, then relayer in cleanish tunics. Of course, not everyone got the spa treatment. Out in the smaller farms and isolated homesteads, winter bathing was more rustic. Maybe a heated stone basin, a ladle of warm water, a cloth rubbed down by the hearth, no tub, no bubbles. But still, better than nothing. Children were cleaned with care, often using snow rubbed briskly over their limbs. Shocking, sure, but it flushed the skin and helped build cold resistance. Or so they said. You watch a toddler shriek and giggle as her mother scrubs her with a handful of snow, both of them red-cheeked and laughing. There's a rhythm to Viking hygiene. It's not constant, not obsessive, but it's deliberate. You don't bathe for fun. You bathe because dirt gets under your nails. Lice hide in your braids and frostbite waits for neglected toes. Outside, snow falls softly like powdered sugar from a giant hand. The wind's calmed. For once, it doesn't feel like nature is trying to kill you. You step out, bucket in hand, to fetch water. The stream nearby hasn't frozen yet, thank the gods, and you hack a hole in the crust of ice. Scoop, haul, repeat. Every drop matters. You splash a little water on your face. It burns at first. Then it numbs. Then it wakes you up in a way no Viking coffee ever could. You stagger back to the longhouse, dripping and gasping, but refreshed. Back inside, a man oils his hair with animal fat. A woman plucks at her eyebrows with iron tweezers. Kids are cleaning their teeth with chewed birch twigs. And someone is flossing. With horsehair? Honestly, respect. And remember, this isn't vanity, it's resistance. In a world where open wounds could kill, where parasites thrived in close quarters, where winter was the perfect breeding ground for illness, cleanliness wasn't optional. It was armor. You sit by the fire, rubbing warmth back into your fingers. A woman hands you a strip of linen and a pot of something gritty. It smells like ashes and mint. Soap, maybe. Tooth scrub, possibly. Floor cleaner? Hopefully not all three. You try it on your hands. It works, sort of, and here's a final fringe note. Some believe Vikings used powdered charcoal mixed with herbs to absorb sweat and odor. Like ancient deodorant. Was it effective? Let's just say better than nothing. You lean back, freshly rinsed, hands scrubbed, hair rebraided by a kindly old woman who didn't even ask. Your skin tingles. Your heart hums. You smell faintly of wood smoke and juniper, and for once, you don't feel like a visitor. You feel like part of the rhythm. The morning fire, the shared comb, the steam, the snow, the fight against decay. Because in the end, staying clean wasn't just about survival, it was about dignity. And dignity in winter is worth its weight in mead. You're still toweling the melted snow off your eyebrows when someone bursts through the longhouse door, tracking slush and excitement in equal measure. Her cheeks are flushed, not from cold, but from fear. Or maybe reverence. She mutters something under her breath, eyes wide. It doesn't take long for whispers to ripple through the longhouse like smoke. The storm last night? It wasn't just weather, it was something else. Welcome to the spiritual side of surviving winter. The realm of spirits, gods, and snowstorms that definitely weren't just natural. In Norse culture, winter wasn't just a season. It was a force, a character, a living, breathing, unpredictable entity with moods and motives. And every snap of ice, every shriek of wind, every blizzard rolling down from the mountains, that wasn't climate. That was a message, or a punishment, or both. The people in this longhouse don't talk about weather like you do. You say it's cold. They say Scotty walks tonight. Scotty, the winter goddess. A giantess, huntress, snowbringer. She wore snowshoes, carried a bow, and lived in the highest mountains. When frost bit your fingers, they said it was Scotty's kiss. Romantic, if your idea of love includes mild hypothermia. And then there's Thor. Not the Marvel version with a perfect beard and a workout plan. The real Thor, weather god, protector, thunder wielder. When lightning flashed in the distance or avalanches rumbled down, it wasn't bad luck. It was Thor battling giants in the clouds. Every roar of thunder, a hammer strike, every gust of wind, the breath of something massive. You're handed a carved wooden talisman. It's a tiny Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, worn around the neck or hung above a child's cradle. For protection, for warmth, for keeping the frost giants at bay. Historians still argue whether these charms were religious symbols or simply cultural identifiers. But to the Vikings, it didn't matter. If wearing a hammer kept your longhouse from getting buried in snow, you wore the hammer. Quirky belief time. Some Norse people thought storms were caused by sky riders, ghostly hunters flying through the night sky, chasing invisible prey. This idea evolved into legends like the Wild Hunt, where spectral warriors galloped through the dark, howling like wolves. If you saw them, it meant doom, or at the very least a very cold week. The longhouse quiets as an elder begins to chant. It's not a hymn, it's not even a prayer. It's more like a lullaby sung to the wind, a rhythmic offering. You don't understand the words, but you feel them in your chest, low and rumbling like distant thunder. Smoke rises. A woman throws herbs into the fire. Juniper, mugwort, maybe a dried bit of something sacred. The room fills with a sweet, spicy scent that clears your nose and wraps around your skull like a hood. Is it for the gods? For protection? For the vibes? Probably all three. You've never seen fear look so calm before. Outside, the wind picks up again. Snow begins to fall sideways. The sky turns heavy, pressing low like a blanket soaked in dread. Someone mutters something about Loki, that chaotic trickster god. They say he rides with the snowstorms when he's bored, tangling sleigh runners and stealing warmth just for fun. But it's not all dread. The Norse also believed in solstice magic. that during the darkest time of year, the veil between worlds grew thin. You could speak to your ancestors. Leave offerings on the snow. Ask for guidance or forgiveness. You're shown the small shrine at the back of the longhouse. It's humble. A few stones, a wooden figure of Odin, an antler, a bundle of herbs tied with red wool. Offerings are laid out: bread, a bit of mead, a strip of cloth. Not bribes, thanks. Survival here isn't owed, it's earned, with humility, with reverence. And here's a fringe theory scholars love to argue about. Some think Vikings believed that each home had a guardian spirit, a land wight, that needed to be respected, fed, and occasionally sung to. You don't own your home. You negotiate with the spirit who lets you stay there. So when the wind batters the walls and the fire flickers low, and someone swears they heard footsteps on the roof, you don't investigate. You whisper your thanks. You close your eyes. And you let the old gods sort it out. The longhouse smells different tonight. Richer, spicier, louder. Someone's pounding on a drum. Someone else is singing a verse that involves a goat, a jug of mead, and questionable morals. You don't understand every word, but the mood is clear. It's Yule. And tonight, the Vikings throw the wildest party winter's ever seen. Forget modern Christmas with its neatly wrapped gifts and awkward family dinners. Yule was raw, chaotic, joyful, and sometimes terrifying. A 12-day festival of firelight, food, storytelling, and survival bragging rights. If you made it this far into the winter, you deserved a party. At the center of it all is the Yule log, an actual tree trunk, hauled inside and burned for multiple days. Not a cute chocolate cake or scented candle. A whole chunk of forest. The fire from the Yule log symbolized the returning sun, the promise of warmth, and, if you were feeling dramatic, the line between life and death. As flames dance in the hearth, people gather in a circle. Faces glow orange, shadows flicker on the walls, and mugs of steaming mead are passed around like sacred relics. You take one, sip deeply, and immediately feel like you could wrestle a frost giant with your pinky toe. Food is everywhere. Roasted meats, dried sausages, butter-rich flatbreads, and something suspiciously pudding-like served with a wink. There's also a stew so thick the ladle stands up in it, and a dish that may or may not contain mushrooms from the fun side of the forest. Everyone's chewing. Everyone's laughing. Someone's trying to balance a goat skull on their head. Standard Viking holiday behavior. Quirky fact time? Yule goats were a thing. Actual goats and wooden figurines. Some think the tradition stems from Thor's chariot being pulled by two immortal goats. Others believe it's tied to fertility and harvest rituals. Either way, Vikings loved a goat. Some homes even had children dress as goats go door to door demanding food and drinks. Sound familiar? That's basically Viking trick-or-treating with livestock cosplay. But the fun wasn't just about food. It was about memory. About honoring the past. During Yule, the dead were invited back to feast. Plates were laid out for lost relatives. Stories were told in their honor. And sometimes you'd sleep with a light burning by the door, so spirits could find their way in without getting cranky and knocking over your mead stash. Historians still argue whether Yule was more pagan than practical. Some say it was a harvest celebration carried over into winter. Others believe it was deeply spiritual, a way of acknowledging the gods, the ancestors, and the terrifying power of the snow. In truth, it was probably both. After all, if your world was ruled by freezing darkness for half the year, you'd want to light something on fire and shout about it too. One of the most iconic Yule traditions? Sacrifice. Before you panic, yes, animals, not people. Usually, a pig, goat, or occasionally a horse was offered to the gods in thanks for survival and in hope of better days ahead. The meat was shared in a feast, and the blood, called halakter, was sometimes sprinkled on statues or sacred trees. Think of it as spiritual seasoning. Gruesome? A little, but symbolic. Absolutely. And then came the toasts. Vikings didn't just drink, they toasted with purpose. First to the gods, then to the king or chieftain, then to their ancestors, and then, finally, to themselves and their loved ones. Every round was a moment of connection, of saying, hey, we're still here, and that deserves a drink. You're nudged toward the center of the longhouse. Someone hands you a carved horn, full to the brim. A hush falls, all eyes on you. It's your turn. You raise the horn and offer a toast to warmth, to the fire, to the absurdity of surviving a snowstorm with only dried fish and goat hair mittens. People laugh. You drink. They cheer. And suddenly, you're a part of something ancient. Music begins again. Bone flutes, drums, voices rising. A young man jumps up and starts dancing in circles, then another. Soon the floor shakes under the weight of stomping boots and joyful chaos. The longhouse becomes a blur of movement, fur, and firelight. Someone starts reciting a saga. Not reading, chanting. The tale of a warrior who skied across a frozen lake to deliver news of a siege. His toes fell off. He made it anyway. Hero or cautionary tale? Hard to say. The kids love it. Outside, snow falls, but it's no longer a threat. It's a backdrop. A soft, silver curtain around your glowing world. And here's a fringe idea. Some scholars think Yule was also a kind of social recalibration. A chance to patch relationships, forgive debts, or even choose new leaders. When the world outside was deadly, inside needed peace. And so they danced, drank, laughed, prayed, together. The fire crackles. A child falls asleep mid-song. An elder pets a dozing dog. Someone snores beside the mead barrel. And you? You sit back, dazed full, glowing from within. Because here in the middle of the darkest season, you've found light, and it dances. The echoes of Yule laughter still hum in your ears as you step outside the longhouse the next morning, boots crunching into fresh, powdery snow. Your breath rises in ghostly plumes, and even the trees look exhausted. Bare, ice-coated, standing like old warriors too stubborn to fall. Today's mission? Not feasting. Not singing. Traveling. Because even in the coldest, darkest weeks of the year, Vikings didn't just hunker down. Sometimes they had to move, to trade, to hunt, to deliver messages, or to chase after runaway goats. And this is where it gets impressive. The Vikings weren't just winter survivors, they were cold weather navigators. Masters of snow, riders of ice, champions of skis, sleds, and sheer Nordic audacity. You follow a group heading out on what looks like a supply run. Each is wrapped head to toe, cloaked in furs and thick wool, their eyes squinting into the low winter light. Behind them, sleds. Pulled by dogs or sometimes by humans themselves, these wooden platforms slide almost effortlessly across the crusted snow. Well, almost. Viking sleds were built low and long, with curved runners and flat beds to carry firewood, food, supplies, or people too weak to walk. The wood was treated with fish oil or animal fat to help it glide over ice. Ingenious, right? And very smelly. You grab the handle of one and give it a push. It creaks but moves. You're now officially part of the Viking Postal Service. But let's not forget the real winter MVP, skis. That's right, Vikings skied. Not for sport, though they did have ski-based competitions, but for pure practical survival. Their skis were long, narrow wooden planks, sometimes curved at the tips, strapped to leather boots with cords. No fancy bindings, no goggles, just grit, balance, and thigh muscles carved from pure determination. Some Viking sagas even mention gods on skis. Ueliar, for example, the Norse god of skiing and archery. They actually worshipped a deity of snow sports. Try topping that with your après-ski hot cocoa. Quirky fact time? Archaeologists have found ski fragments in Norway dating back over 1,300 years. That's right. While the rest of Europe was slipping around in the mud, The Vikings were shredding powder like bearded Olympians. You strap on a pair with help from one of the locals. He doesn't speak much, but his expression says, "This is going to be funny." And it is, at least for everyone watching. You wobble, you flail, you fall. Gracefully, of course. Right into a snowbank. Someone claps. You bow. Despite the struggle, there's something magical about gliding across a frozen landscape. The world is silent but alive. Pines whisper under snow. Crows caw overhead. The wind hums against your ears. You begin to understand how Vikings traveled miles across tundra, hunted elk in the forest, and delivered messages between isolated settlements without waiting for the snow to melt. Historians still debate how often these journeys happened during the worst months. Some argue that travel was limited to emergencies. Others believe it was more common, especially for well-equipped families or warrior bands trained to endure everything nature could hurl their way. Let's not forget the snowshoes either. Essential when skis weren't practical. Made of bent wood and rawhide webbing, they distributed weight evenly across the snow. Vikings didn't invent them, but they adopted them fast, especially in Norway and the far north. You pause at the edge of a frozen lake. The surface gleams like glass, cracked with spiderweb lines. The others press forward, some skating, others carefully sledding across. You hold your breath and follow, feeling each step vibrate through your bones. But the ice holds, and then you see it. A group of Viking children racing across the lake on bone skates. Not steel, bone. Animal bones, shaved and smoothed, tied to boots with leather cords. They glide like ghosts, laughing, falling, getting up, racing again. You want to try it, but your tailbone politely declines. Instead, you find yourself pulled onto a sled. A large dog team surges forward, and just like that, you're flying. The wind slices your cheeks. Snow blasts your face. Trees blur past. And for a moment, you feel exactly how those Viking couriers must have felt. Fast, fierce, unstoppable. You arrive back at the longhouse after hours on the trail. Cold in your fingers, ice in your hair, but also adrenaline singing through your chest like a saga set to drums. And as you step inside, shedding furs and layers, someone hands you a bowl of broth. Another throws an extra fur over your shoulders. No applause, no celebration. Just silent acknowledgement, you made it. Because out here, travel isn't optional. It's part of life. Even in snow that swallows roads and winds that whisper ancient threats, the Vikings moved. Always forward, always ready. And tonight, you've earned your spot by the fire. You're only halfway through your warm broth, steam curling into your eyebrows, when a man bursts through the longhouse door with a look that says, "Pack your things or die." No time for soup. Just like that, the entire room shifts. Someone grabs a bundle of weapons. A woman pulls a child to her chest. Someone mutters a name, probably a local chieftain. And then, with a speed that's both practiced and chilling, the room empties. What's happening? A winter raid. Yep, that's right. Vikings didn't just survive the cold. Sometimes they fought in it, and not because they were bored. Raiding during winter might seem insane to you, and to be fair, it kinda was. But sometimes it was also smart. Let's break it down. First, surprise. Who expects an attack when snow is falling sideways and your livestock are half frozen in the barn? Winter raids caught enemies off guard, especially in milder southern regions that didn't even have real winters. Raiding parties would show up out of nowhere, fur-cloaked, ice-bearded, eyes wild, and pillage before anyone could scream, "Where are my mittens?" Second, frozen terrain meant frozen rivers. Vikings loved rivers. They were highways for their sleek, shallow longships. But in the dead of winter, those same waterways became icy highways for sleds, skis, and fast overland movement. Bridges? Who needs them? Frozen fjords were better than toll roads. You sit back by the fire trying to imagine it. A war band strapping on mail armor, tightening the belts on their sheepskin boots, and skiing silently across moonlit snow to descend on an unsuspecting village. It's not a fantasy, it's historical madness. Historians still argue how common winter raids were. Some believe they were rare exceptions. Others suggest entire campaigns were timed around seasons, like chess players counting turns until the frost gave them an edge. Either way, there's one thing nobody debates. When the Vikings did go to war in the winter, they were terrifying. Let's talk gear. You'd think they'd freeze, right? Nope. Wool tunics under chainmail, fur-lined cloaks, leather gloves with reinforced knuckles. Helmets, usually iron, sometimes with simple eye guards. Not horns. That's pure Hollywood nonsense. You'd never put horns on a helmet in battle unless you were actively trying to be headbutted by your own fashion sense. As for footwear, boots of leather stuffed with straw or wool. Yes, they got wet. Yes, they froze. But Vikings knew how to move. Fast, efficient. No standing around for hours like some parade army. You sprint in, swing a sword, grab what you need, and get out before frostbite introduces itself by name. And remember, warfare wasn't just distant fields and epic duels. It was close. Brutal. Cold steel meeting colder nights. Imagine holding a sword with numb fingers, trying to shout orders while your teeth chatter. Stepping over frozen bodies that crunch underfoot like driftwood. But here's the wild part. Some Vikings went barefoot, at least according to the sagas. Quirky detail incoming. There's an old Icelandic account of a berserker who fought barefoot in the snow, shirtless, roaring like an animal. The theory is that berserkers, those wild, trance-like warriors, entered such a state of frenzy that they felt no cold, no pain, no fear. Just rage. And maybe some questionable mushrooms. Is it true? Historians still argue. But the image? Chilling. Literally. Of course, not all winter combat was organized. Sometimes it was survival. A snowstorm forced two clans to camp too close. A hunting party trespassed. A stolen sheep sparked blood feud number 479. Fighting in snowdrifts was messy, unpredictable, and more likely to end in everyone shivering than anyone winning. You stare into the fire, watching the flames flicker like distant torches on a battlefield. Someone nearby sharpens a blade. Not out of panic, just routine. Because here, even peace includes preparation. The line between hunter and hunted is paper thin, and winter, with its long nights and slow responses, amplifies every risk. But war wasn't always about killing. Sometimes it was about presence. A show of force. Riding into town in full gear just to remind folks who holds the power, even if your sword stays sheathed. A cold flex, if you will. And you know what? Sometimes it worked. Villages surrendered without a fight. Gifts were exchanged, honor was satisfied, and the long march home was taken under a full moon with sacks full of offerings instead of bruises. You glance toward the longhouse door. Snow swirls outside. A figure returns, frost on his beard, breath huffing in clouds. No danger this time, just a patrol. A warning from a neighboring farm. All is well, for now. Everyone relaxes. The tension melts faster than an icicle over soup. And you? You sip your now lukewarm broth and think about what it takes to survive a winter and a war. It's not just brute strength, it's timing, planning, knowing when to strike and when to wait. Because in the Viking world, every snowflake carried a whisper. You'd better be ready. Later that night, with the fire low and the longhouse quieter than it's been in days, you notice something softer. A child curled in a fur by the hearth. An elder humming gently while rubbing salve into their cracked hands. A mother adjusting a sleeping bundle. No shouting, no feasting. Just breathing. Together. It's easy to forget amid all the war paint, axes, and bone-chilling survival tricks that Vikings were families first. And in the dead of winter, protecting the most vulnerable, the children, the elderly, the sick, became just as crucial as raiding or hunting. Maybe more so. Because here's the truth. Winter didn't care how brave you were. It crept in through gaps in the thatch, numbed your fingers, stole your breath while you slept. And if you weren't careful, it took those you loved the most first. You watch as a woman checks on a baby swaddled in wool, her hands practiced, her expression unreadable. The infant barely stirs. There's no crib, just furs, skin-to-skin warmth, and the constant presence of another body to keep the cold away. Child mortality was high, especially in winter. Infants were fragile. One bad chill, one infection, one food shortage, and they were gone. Which is why Viking parents didn't just love their children, they defended them against the season itself. That meant feeding them first, wrapping them in the warmest furs, letting them sleep closest to the fire, even if it meant someone else took the cold corner. Because what's the point of surviving winter if your legacy doesn't? Quirky but true. Archaeologists have found Viking cradles carved with protective runes, little charms designed to ward off illness and spirits. Some were tucked with amulets, beads, or even bits of iron, thought to scare off the Draugr, the undead, who supposedly stalked during long, dark nights. And it wasn't just children. The elderly, grandparents, widows, those too frail to chop wood or haul water, were treated with reverence. They weren't dead weight. They were memory keepers, teachers, storytellers, living libraries. Their knowledge of weather patterns, herbal remedies, family sagas, priceless. You see an old man slowly stitching a boot by firelight, fingers stiff but steady. He doesn't talk much, doesn't need to. His presence alone is enough. You can feel the respect radiating around him like heat. Historians still argue whether Viking society truly respected the old, or whether it romanticized strength above all else. But many sagas mention wise elders as central figures, guiding decisions, healing wounds, and occasionally yelling at younger warriors for being idiots. You glance toward one of the longhouse corners and see another quiet scene. Two teenagers patiently feeding their sick brother, who's wrapped in 3 furs and coughing weakly. They hold the bowl. They wipe his chin. They whisper encouragement in the form of teasing insults. It's raw. It's real. This question mark. This is winter survival. Not glamorous raids, not frostbite challenges, but showing up for each other every single day, even when the world outside feels like it's frozen over with indifference. And speaking of care, herbal knowledge was key. The Vikings may not have had hospitals, but they had healers. Women and men who knew which bark soothed fevers, which root eased pain, and which mushroom to avoid unless you wanted to see gods you didn't believe in. You're handed a cup of something warm and slightly bitter. It's a tonic. For warmth. For digestion. Maybe for dreaming. You sip it anyway because by now you've learned not to ask too many questions about what's in the cup. Fringe theory incoming. Some scholars believe Vikings tracked the sun's movement and moon cycles to time healing rituals or predict weather shifts. Was it science? Magic? Or just really good observational memory? Doesn't matter. It worked. And now, the part you don't want to think about, but you know you have to. Death. Yes, sometimes the old didn't make it through the winter. Sometimes the child's cough didn't go away. Sometimes food ran short and choices had to be made. But even then, even in those unthinkable moments, there was ritual. Dignity. Grief expressed through song, through runes carved into wood, through quiet vigils beside the fire. Vikings didn't fear death, but they respected it. You sit by a woman cradling a young boy, maybe 5 years old, who's asleep with his thumb in his mouth and a fox fur cap over his eyes. She brushes snowflakes from his lashes. Just in case. Because even in a world ruled by frost, love stays warm. The snow has stopped falling. Finally. You hear it before you see it. The unmistakable rhythm of words. Not shouted, not whispered. Just spoken. Repeated. Embroidered into the firelight like thread through wool. A woman sits cross-legged, surrounded by children and a few half-asleep adults. Her hands move in slow circles as she speaks, and you quickly realize she's not chatting. She's storytelling. And not just any story. This is a saga. Tonight you get to witness one of the Vikings' most powerful winter survival tools. Words. No Wi-Fi, no TikTok, no Netflix, no books even. Not in the modern sense. So, what did you do on a long, dark, freezing night when you couldn't raid, couldn't farm, and couldn't feel your toes? You told stories, epic ones, funny ones, sad ones. Some so weird they may have been born from moldy bread hallucinations. But they all mattered, because stories kept people awake, focused, human, and they weren't just entertainment, they were currency, history, training, therapy, religion. This woman, she's reciting Egil's saga, about a warrior poet with a temper, a drinking problem, and a talent for verse. One moment he's swinging a sword, the next he's composing a heartbreaking poem over his son's grave. The kids stare wide-eyed, fully immersed. These sagas weren't improvised, they were memorized, sometimes hundreds of lines long, passed from generation to generation with minimal change. Each word carried weight, each pause had purpose. Quirky fact. Some Vikings practiced flighting, a poetic insult battle like ancient Norse rap battles around the fire. Think 8 Mile, but in wool cloaks and with references to goat theft and dishonored ancestors. Lose a flighting match? Public humiliation. Win? Legendary status. Probably some free mead. You lean in as another storyteller takes the stage. He begins a tale of a sea serpent longer than a longhouse, whose scales shimmered like ice. No one blinks. Some stories are true. Some aren't. No one cares. Because this is how they taught their children bravery, how they remembered their dead, how they explained thunder, earthquakes, and heartbreak. You sip a warm drink, probably broth, maybe mead, possibly both, and listen. The room is hypnotized. The only sounds are the crackling fire and the storyteller's voice, low and slow like falling snow. Historians still argue whether these oral traditions were 100% accurate or constantly evolving, but most agree they were crucial. A saga was living. It breathed with the teller. It shifted with the needs of the room. And here's a fringe theory for you. Some believe Vikings used storytelling as a mental tool to delay sleep. Why? Because in extreme cold, falling into a deep sleep too quickly could be fatal. Better to drift slowly, surrounded by narrative warmth, than risk slipping into the wrong kind of silence. You watch as a boy tells a joke about Odin's missing eye and a fish. Everyone groans. Someone throws a crust of bread at him. He beams with pride. Comedy lives here too, dry, sharp, occasionally confusing, but full of life. And then something surprising. A young girl steps up, barely 10 years old. She begins to tell her own story, about a fox who outwits a frost giant using only a pine cone and a very convincing chicken impression. The delivery is shaky. The logic is elastic. But the room applauds. She blushes and runs back to her mother's lap, because this is how sagas begin, with the bravery to speak, with the warmth to listen. A dog snores loudly nearby. An old man hums the chorus of a story song under his breath. You feel yourself leaning further into your fur, your shoulders relaxing, your heart slowing. These aren't just stories, they're insulation for the soul. And as you listen, you realize something profound. Fire warms the body. But stories warm the mind. You're nearly asleep when something snorts loudly next to you. You jolt upright. It's not a Viking. It's not even a person. It's a goat, curled into a ball, steam rising off its thick fur, snoring like it owns the longhouse. And honestly, it kinda does. Because tonight you're learning about one of the Vikings' most underrated winter survival secrets. Animals. Not just for food. Not just for labor, but for warmth. for closeness, for companionship, and occasionally for very loud snoring. That goat is not just a goat, it's central heating. Let's rewind. Imagine a Viking longhouse in January. Snow piled shoulder high, wind rattling the beams. Fire crackling, sure, but not enough to reach every corner, so what do? You bring the animals inside. Cows, sheep, goats, chickens, even horses if they're small and polite enough. They're penned at one end of the longhouse or roam freely in the communal area, depending on how fancy or desperate the setup is. You'd think this would make everything filthy. And okay, yes, there's some poop involved, but it also makes the longhouse warmer by several precious degrees. Animal bodies radiate heat. Their breath fills the air with warmth. Their movement stirs circulation. They turn the longhouse into a shared furnace of fur and hooves. Quirky fact: Viking dogs weren't just pets, they were workers. Herding, guarding, and yep, heating. Some sagas describe dogs sleeping with their humans under the same furs. Not because it's cute, although, let's be real, it is, but because that dog is a mobile, tail-wagging, meat-scented heat source. Cats, too, played their part. Believed to be sacred to Freya, the goddess of love, beauty, and war, an iconic combo, cats were treasured. They kept the vermin down. They purred. They curled up in baskets near the fire and acted like they owned everything. Classic cat behavior, classic Viking vibes. And then the chickens. Loud, weird, slightly terrifying in the dark, but valuable. Not just for eggs and meat, but because when chickens got agitated, it usually meant something was coming. A person, a predator, or maybe just a squirrel having an identity crisis outside. Either way, chickens were the first alarm system in your frost-bitten world. You wander to the livestock area. No walls separate them, just bundles of hay and rope barriers. A cow shifts slightly, its flank warm and steamy. A pig grunts softly. You swear it's dreaming. A horse snorts in its sleep and kicks once, then stills. These animals weren't tools. They were family. Children named them. Elders blessed them. People talked to them during long nights. Not because they expected an answer, but because sometimes you just needed someone to hear you. Even if that someone was a shaggy ewe with a drooling problem. Historians still argue how common it was for animals to sleep in the living quarters rather than nearby barns. But in harsher winters, especially in isolated regions, there's no debate. You kept them close, because if they froze, you lost more than warmth. You lost milk, eggs, future meals. You lost hope. Fringe theory? Some scholars suggest certain families even believed their animals had protective spirits, that a favored ox might bring good luck, that a particular chicken could ward off frost. Were these superstitions? Probably. But also, would you risk it? Not when the night outside looks like the gods are shaking powdered sugar onto the earth with rage. You sit beside a young boy brushing a shaggy dog's coat. He sings softly, not for you, not even for the dog, but for the silence, for the moment. The fire pops. The goat next to you shifts and resumes snoring. A woman nearby bundles up next to a cow, her back to its belly. The cow doesn't seem to mind, neither does she. It's warm. That's all that matters. You've eaten their meat, worn their hides, carved their bones into tools. But in winter, animals weren't just survival resources. They were survival partners. You lean back, the goat now pressed against your thigh like a half-drunk uncle at a feast. Its warmth seeps into you. So does its smell, which is intense. But who cares? You've learned to stop judging the scent of survival. And in this moment, surrounded by creatures great and small, some asleep, some twitching, some mumbling in their own language, you feel it. You are not alone. In the Viking world, that meant everything. The longhouse is quiet now. Not just soft, but deeply quiet. The kind of silence that only arrives after a long winter's night full of firelight, laughter, movement, mead, and memory. Even the goats have stopped snoring. The dog beside you has curled into a tight, satisfied loaf. Somewhere, someone's humming a lullaby under their breath. You can't tell who. It just exists, and you? You're warm. You're full. You're calm. But outside, the cold hasn't forgotten you. It waits, patiently. It always does. Which brings us to the hardest truth of Viking winters, when fire fails. Because sometimes even with every trick, every layer of wool, every mouthful of stew and story, the cold wins. It starts with a dwindling woodpile, or a sudden storm that blocks the path to the stream. Maybe someone falls sick. Maybe too many mouths and not enough food. Or maybe the fire just dies in the middle of the night, and no one wakes in time to relight it. You hear the elders talk about those winters in hushed tones. That winter, the long winter, the one when the goats froze standing up, when the fjord never thawed, when even the hearthstone cracked from the cold. You glance toward the wall, someone's carved tally marks. You don't know if they count days or people or losses. You don't ask. A small shrine sits in the corner. A figure of Odin wrapped in red yarn, a sprig of pine, a cracked bowl, empty, offerings made, promises whispered. Survival wasn't just about effort, it was about favor. Because when all else failed, when your hands went numb, when the soup ran thin, when you couldn't feel your toes and your laughter had frozen in your chest, there was one last refuge. Belief. In the gods, in the spirits, in Valhalla. Vikings didn't fear death the way you might. Death was a part of the rhythm, especially in winter. It was near. Always. But it wasn't always tragic. Sometimes when a person passed in the cold, the family would wrap them in their finest furs, place their tools or jewelry by their side, and lay them in a shallow grave dug through frozen soil with fire-softened axes. Sometimes the body was burned instead, sent to the gods on a ship of flame. A release. A return. And in that final moment, they believed the soul was carried to the Hall of Warriors, Valhalla, where the fires were always warm, the mead never ran dry, and the cold never reached your bones again. Historians still debate how literally Vikings believed this. Was Valhalla a real destination, or a metaphor for bravery in the face of certain death? Who knows? But does it matter? In a world ruled by snow and silence, having anywhere to imagine, any hope, was power. You look around the longhouse. People are asleep, limbs tangled, chins tucked to chests, hands resting over bellies. Someone murmurs in their dreams. The fire has burned low, casting long orange shadows that stretch and shrink like breath. And now comes your own descent into sleep. You lie back. The fur is heavy. The straw beneath you creaks. Your fingers are warm. Your feet are dry. The cold is still out there, prowling around the longhouse, pressing its face to the cracks in the walls, licking the edge of the roof like a beast made of wind and hunger. But it hasn't gotten in. Not tonight. Because this is how the Vikings survived the coldest nights of the year. They layered, they ate, they drank, they moved, they listened, they laughed, they believed. They bundled together under roofs of straw and hope, and told stories that held off the dark just a little longer. And when the fire flickered out, they waited for the light. The fire crackles low now, its heat soft and rhythmic, like a heartbeat at rest. Outside, the snow falls again, but gentler this time. No wind, no storm, just soft flakes drifting down like ash from the sky. The world has gone still. The trees sleep. The rivers sigh under their frozen skin. Even the stars feel drowsy tonight. Inside, every breath is slow. Every movement is a murmur. Your body, wrapped in fur, hums with borrowed warmth. Your muscles have let go. Your fingers are still. You hear the last log settle into embers. No more chopping, no more rushing, no more proving your worth to the winter, not right now. Because here in the low glow of the Viking longhouse, you are surrounded. Not just by walls or fire, but by memory, by care, by ancient rituals that once kept 1,000 hearts beating through the blackest nights. The goat stirs just once, a soft huff, then silence. Someone beside you whispers a blessing. Not to you, not really. Just to the room, to the air, to the cold, outside, waiting its turn. But not tonight. Tonight the fire held, and so did you. So let your thoughts drift like snow, slow and quiet and certain. There is no rush now, no more wind, just rest. Sleep well, Viking, you made it. Well,